In 1911, Winston Churchill made a technical decision. It would eventually kill millions. It would redraw the map of the world. He changed the fuel of the British Royal Navy from coal to oil. It sounds like a minor engineering tweak, but Britain sat on mountains of coal and absolutely zero oil. This meant the British Empire could no longer survive within its own borders. It had to step out. It had to conquer the land where the oil flowed. That land was the Ottoman Empire. The Navy needed fuel. Therefore, the Middle East had to burn. Welcome to History Insight. We explore the rise and fall of empires. Because behind every golden age lies a quiet decay, a rot no one sees until it is too late. We usually think of the First World War as a clash of treaties, a web of alliances, the assassination of an archduke in Sarajevo. We picture the trenches in France and the blood-soaked mud of the Somme, but there was another war raging in the shadows. A war that had absolutely nothing to do with liberty, democracy, or the rights of small nations. It was a war of corporate acquisition, a violent, hostile takeover of the Middle East's energy reserves. To understand why, you have to step onto the steel deck of a battleship in 1910. Feel the cold, salt wind. At that time, the Royal Navy was the undisputed master of the seas. It was the ultimate guarantor of British survival. If the Navy failed, Britain would starve in a matter of weeks. For 100 years, this mighty force ran on coal. Coal was the perfect fuel for the empire, because Britain itself was built on coal. The deep mines of Wales produced the finest steam coal on the planet. It was a strategic asset, safe, secure, domestic. If Britain went to war, they didn't need to ask permission to fuel their dreadnoughts. They just dug it straight out of the earth in Cardiff. But coal had a fatal flaw. It was heavy, it was filthy, and above all, it was slow. To refuel a coal ship, you had to stop moving. You had to find a port. Hundreds of exhausted men had to physically shovel tons of black rock into the bunkers. It took days. And when the ship was finally moving, the stokers down in the engine room worked in literal hell, shoveling coal into roaring furnaces just to keep the pressure up. It broke the crew. It capped the top speed of the vessel. Winston Churchill had just been appointed First Lord of the Admiralty. He was young. He was ambitious. He was obsessed with the rising shadow of Germany. Germany was forging a massive fleet to challenge British supremacy. Churchill knew the brutal math of naval warfare. Speed and gun caliber decide who lives and who sinks. His engineers approached him with a radical proposition. Switch the fleet from coal to oil, they said, and we gain a decisive, lethal advantage. Oil packs twice the thermal energy of coal by weight. An oil-burning ship could travel twice as far without stopping. You could refuel at sea by simply connecting a hose to a tanker. The fleet could stay in the fight indefinitely. It cut the engine room crew in half. Crucially, it pushed the ships to velocities the Germans could never catch. Technologically, it was a no-brainer. The oil ships were vastly superior. Yet, a strategic nightmare lurked beneath this proposal. Britain produced zero oil. There were no oil wells in Yorkshire, no gushers in Scotland. By switching to oil, Churchill was proposing to take the beating heart of the British Empire, the Royal Navy, and make it 100% dependent on a foreign resource. It was a gamble of historic, terrifying proportions. Churchill famously declared that committing the Navy to oil was to take arms against a sea of troubles, but he decided the risk of being slow outweighed the risk of running dry. He signed the order. The new Queen Elizabeth-class super dreadnoughts would be oil burners. The moment the ink dried on that order, the foreign policy of Great Britain mutated overnight. Suddenly, the stability of oil-producing regions wasn't just a commercial venture. It was a matter of national survival. So, where was the oil? In 1911, the United States was the heavyweight producer, but the U.S. was a potential rival. Britain couldn't rely on them. The only other massive, proven reserves lay in Persia, modern-day Iran, and in the whispered rumors of vast underground oceans in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. Persia was independent, but fragile. Mesopotamia was a province of the Ottoman Empire. This is where the tragedy of the Middle East truly begins. The Ottomans had ruled this region for centuries. The empire was old, crumbling, often dismissed as the sick man of Europe. As long as the British Navy ran on coal, London was perfectly happy to prop up this sick man. They needed a stable Ottoman state as a buffer against Russia. But the second the Navy switched to oil, the Ottoman Empire morphed into an obstacle. The Ottomans controlled the vital land bridge between the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean. They sat directly on top of the suspected oil fields of Mosul and Baghdad. Worse still, the Ottomans were getting dangerously cozy with Germany. The Germans were constructing a colossal piece of infrastructure, the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. It was designed to link the industrial heart of Germany directly to the oil wealth of the Middle East, completely bypassing the British Navy. Churchill and British planners stared at this map. They panicked. If Germany controlled Ottoman oil, Britain would lose its supremacy over the seas. The strategy abruptly shifted. The Ottoman Empire had to be dismantled. The oil-bearing provinces had to be dragged under direct British control. This wasn't some dark conspiracy theory. It was debated openly on the floor of the House of Commons. In 1914, mere months before the world caught fire, Churchill made a decisive move. He convinced the British government to buy a controlling stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. You know it today as BP. For the first time in history, the British government became a direct shareholder in an oil corporation. They didn't just want to buy the oil, they wanted to own the well. When World War I erupted in August 1914, the public was fed a narrative about defending Little Belgium, but look at where the British troops actually marched. One of the very first military operations of the entire global conflict was not in France, it was in the Persian Gulf. Weeks after the declaration of war, a British expeditionary force landed at Fao in Ottoman Iraq. Their mission? Secure the oil refinery at Abadan and the pipelines pumping crude from Persia. This ignited the Mesopotamian campaign. The British army pushed north toward Basra. They captured the city, but they didn't stop. They kept pushing north, toward Baghdad and Mosul. Why? Why send hundreds of thousands of men to die in the scorching desert heat when the main slaughter was happening in Europe? Because the geologists pointed north. They said the real prizes, the massive oil fields, were around Mosul. The British government was playing a lethal double game. On one hand, they incited the Arabs to rebel against the Turks. They dispatched intelligence officers like T.E. Lawrence of Arabia to court the Sharif of Mecca. They promised the Arabs a grand, independent kingdom. They promised liberation from Turkish tyranny. Lawrence was a romantic. He believed the lies. He fought shoulder to shoulder with Arab tribesmen, dynamiting trains and raiding Ottoman outposts. He assured them that if they helped shatter the Ottoman Empire, they would become masters of their own house. But while Lawrence was whispering promises in the desert wind, bureaucrats in London were tearing them up. In 1916, Britain and France signed a secret pact. The Sykes-Picot Agreement. Mark Sykes and François-Georges Picot sat at a desk with a map of the Middle East and a wooden ruler. They drew a straight line across the sand. They decided France would take Syria and Lebanon, Britain would take Palestine, Jordan, and southern Iraq. But there was a glaring flaw. That map didn't account for the oil in Mosul. Originally, Mosul was slated for the French zone, but as the war dragged on in endless blood and the supreme value of oil became undeniable, the British realized they could never let the French have it. British Prime Minister Lloyd George explicitly demanded that Mosul be attached to the British sphere. So, when the war finally ended, even after the armistice with the Ottomans was signed, the British army kept marching. They raced north to physically occupy the city of Mosul before the peace treaties could freeze the borders. They needed boots on the ground. They needed possession. When the dust settled, the Ottoman Empire was dead. The Sultan was deposed. The Caliphate was abolished. The British and French arrived to collect the spoils. The Arabs, who had bled for their independence, rode into Damascus expecting a crown. Instead, they found British and French generals waiting for them. They were bluntly told there would be no Arab empire. There would be mandates. It was just a polite, bureaucratic word for colonies. The betrayal was absolute. But the specific betrayal of the Kurds and the people of Iraq was dictated entirely by the geology of oil. Britain invented the country of Iraq. They took three entirely distinct Ottoman provinces, Basra in the Shia south, Baghdad in the Sunni center, and Mosul in the Kurdish north. These three groups shared very little. Different religions, different ethnicities, different histories, yet the British stitched them together into one artificial Frankenstein of a state. Why? Because the oil from Mosul in the north had to be piped down to the port of Basra in the south to be loaded onto British tankers. They needed a single, unified political entity to secure that pipeline. So, they drew arbitrary lines on a map, forcing these three groups to live together under a British-backed king. They engineered a country designed to be an oil export terminal, not a nation. That single decision laid the foundation for a century of bloodshed, the chronic instability of modern Iraq, the Kurdish struggle for independence, the bitter sectarian violence between Sunni and Shia. Trace it all back, and you hit the British desperate need to link oil fields to shipping ports. Winston Churchill was now the colonial secretary. He managed this new Middle Eastern empire. He met immediate, fierce resistance. The people of Iraq rose up against the British occupation in 1920. It was a massive, bloody rebellion. But the British public was exhausted by war. They had no appetite to send more sons to hold down a desert province. The cost was too high. So, Churchill engineered a ruthless, modern solution: aerial policing. Instead of deploying expensive ground troops, he unleashed the Royal Air Force to bomb rebellious villages into submission. It was cheaper. It was faster. He famously advocated for deploying chemical weapons, stating, "I am strongly in favor of using poisoned gas against uncivilized tribes." The gas wasn't always lethal, often mustard gas or tear gas, but the intent was chillingly clear. Rule the oil lands from the sky with an iron fist. This was the quiet, undeniable decay of British moral authority. They entered the 20th century, posing as the champions of liberal democracy. By 1920, they were dropping bombs on villages to keep global oil prices low. The Ottoman Empire was a ghost. The Turks retreated to Anatolia and forged the modern Republic of Turkey, but the Middle East they left behind was fractured. The organic structure of the region where ancient trade routes and tribal loyalties dictated borders was obliterated. It was replaced by a sterile grid of pipelines and artificial frontiers. The British got exactly what they wanted. The oil flowed. The Iraq Petroleum Company was born. Despite its name, it was completely owned by British, French, and American oil titans. The Iraqis received pennies in royalties. For the next 30 years, the Royal Navy ruled the waves, powered by the liquefied remains of the Ottoman Empire, but the hidden cost was astronomical. By destroying the Ottoman Empire, Britain ripped off the roof that had sheltered the region's deep sectarian divides for centuries. The Ottomans weren't perfect rulers, but they possessed a system that managed the volatile diversity of the Middle East. When Britain smashed that system to siphon the fuel beneath it, they unleashed forces they could never control. They created a massive power vacuum. Dictators and extremists rushed in to fill it. Ultimately, the oil became a curse for the British Empire, too. The toxic dependency Churchill birthed in 1911 never faded. It only metastasized. As the 20th century accelerated, Britain grew hopelessly addicted to Middle Eastern crude. It was no longer just about the Navy, it was the entire economic engine. The cars, the factories, the power grids. This addiction forced Britain to constantly, obsessively intervene in the region. It drove them to orchestrate the overthrow of Iran's democracy in 1953 when Mossadegh dared to nationalize the oil. It dragged them into the humiliation of the Suez Crisis in 1956. The choice to switch from coal to oil mutated Britain. It changed them from a self-sufficient island fortress into a paranoid global predator, forever terrified about its supply lines. It redefined national security. Before 1911, national security meant guarding the white cliffs of Dover. After 1911, national security meant deploying soldiers to defend a steel pipe in a desert 3,000 miles away. This is the ultimate trap of empire. As you stretch your reach to secure your resources, you exponentially stretch your vulnerability. You birth new enemies. You draw new frontiers that must be defended with blood. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire was no historical accident. It was a controlled demolition. It was the very first major war fought for oil. And when we look back at the carnage of the 20th and 21st centuries, we know it was not the last. Winston Churchill is revered as the man who stood defiant against Hitler, and he earned that legacy. But we must also remember him as the man who looked at a steam engine and calculated that velocity was worth more than stability. He looked at the vast coal reserves of Wales and decided they weren't enough. He made a fateful choice that chained the destiny of the West to the burning sands of the Middle East. Today, when you scroll through the news and see conflicts raging in Iraq or Syria, when you look at rigid maps that make absolutely no geographic sense, when you see silent pipelines guarded by heavily armed soldiers, you are staring directly at the legacy of that single decision. You are living in a world engineered to fuel the battleships of a navy that no longer rules the waves. The dreadnoughts are gone, scrapped and melted down decades ago. But the scars they carved into the Middle East are still bleeding. The Ottoman Empire was executed so the Royal Navy could go a little faster. It is a terrifying, ruthless equation. But within the cold logic of empires, it makes perfect sense. This is History Insight. Energy is the bedrock of civilization, but the desperate hunt for energy almost always ends in barbarism. You like to think you drive your car. But the truth is, you are driven by the insatiable hunger of the fuel tank. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you in the next video.